act loopy today. That's what it is. Our talk is called German Influences in Louisville, and it is based on, there it goes. It is based on two books that we edited. Germans in Louisville came out in 2015. German Influences in Louisville in 2019. Despite the titles on the books, because that's the way the publisher wanted it, these are part one and part two of a complete history of German immigration to Louisville. The first one published since 1873. That one was in German, by the way. This is a map of Louisville in 1832. It appeared in the first city directory of Louisville, and it shows the extent of the city, which is not very much. At the time, there were 10,000 people who lived in Louisville in 1832. The city went south no further than Broadway, which was called Prentice Street at that time. On the west, it went to 12th. On the east, it went to Baxter Avenue, and of course on the north, the Ohio River. And you can see the Beargrass Creek there flowing into the Ohio River and emptying at the foot of 4th Street. Over a period of years, that creek became an open sewer. So in the late 1850s, they rerouted it to go into the Ohio River at Butchertown, which is where it goes in today. In 1832, there were only 5 German-born heads of households in Louisville. The first one, a man named August David Eric, came in 1817. So by 1832, the population of German-speaking or German-born people in Louisville had only grown to 25. But would you believe it if I told you by 1840 there were 4,000 Germans in Louisville? So why the big increase? Well, 2 reasons for that. First, the German Confederation was established in 1815 by the Congress of Vienna, which settled the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. They decided to take 39 small kingdoms, duchies, free states, and other principalities who all spoke German and slap them into something called the German Confederation. It had a very weak central government, and so it was doomed to fail. By the 1830s, the economy had floundered, and most Germans, not seeing any prospect for the future, decided to get up and leave. So in the 1820s, only 4,000 Germans immigrated to the United States, but in the 1830s, 140,000 came to the United States. So that's part of the story on the big increase of Germans in Louisville. But the second part of that story is that when these German immigrants got to the eastern shores of our country, how did they get inland? Because inland is where the land was. And that's what they wanted, was what they couldn't have in Germany, which was land to farm. So they had to get into the interior of the country somehow. There were no roads built. The railroads didn't extend that far into the country, but there were rivers. So they traveled on the rivers to get to the interior of the country. It so happened that in the 1830s, the steamboat was just starting to come into its heyday. So you could hop on a steamboat and go along the river and get off wherever you wanted. Of course, Louisville is one of the places where they would go and maybe get off and stay. And especially with the falls here, where they had to get off. And in order to continue going upstream, they would have to go around the falls and get back on another boat at the wharf on 4th Street. A lot of them just stayed. So Louisville saw a huge influx of Germans starting in the 1830s.
What did you say the number was? Germans in Louisville in 1830?
1830, it was about 1825. 1840 is about 4,000. This shows German immigration to the United States by a decade from 1820 to 2010. Down at the bottom, this little bar here, that's the 4,000 people who came in the 1820s. That's the 140,000 who came in the 1830s. The 1840s was about 400,000, close to 1 million in the 1850s, and all of a sudden it dropped off. Have any idea why?
Civil War?
Yeah, Civil War. This is dip in immigration due to the Civil War and post-war. 1880s was the largest decade of immigration, almost 1.5 million. There's a very easy way to sum this up. From 1820 up to the Civil War, 1.5 million Germans came to the United States. From the Civil War to World War I, 4 million came. And from World War I to the present day, another 2 million came. And if you're adding those numbers, it's 7.5 million Germans came from 1820 to the present day. That is the most of any ethnic group, including the Irish. They only have about 4.5 million. When the Germans got to Louisville, they wanted to go to church. They found that the churches had services only in English, and they didn't understand English, so they built their own churches. There were about equal numbers of Catholics and Protestants who came to Louisville, and a small number of Jews who came to Louisville. The first German Catholic church, in which German was the language in services, and the school, which they had, was taught in German. St. Boniface Church was at Liberty and Jackson Street. In those days, Liberty was known as Green Street. The first Protestant church in the middle was St. Paul Evangelical Church, and the only piece of St. Paul Evangelical Church that is left is Bethel St. Paul, which is near here. Temple Addis Israel was the first house of Jewish worship. It was established in 1842. By the year 1855, there were 4 German Catholic churches, 4 or 5 German Protestant churches, and 2 Jewish congregations. All of the Catholic churches had schools. One of them was St. Martin of Tours. St. Martin of Tours was built in 1853. The pastor of St. Martin Church was a man named Leander Straber, and he went to Germany in 1858 looking for a German-speaking religious who could teach in his school. And he found 3 Ursuline nuns who would come with him back to the United States. So that is the beginning of the Ursuline story in Louisville. The Ursulines have done a lot in Louisville, including teaching in most Catholic schools. They had a Catholic high school here for a period of time, and they have had also Ursuline College, which has become part of Bellarmine now. Some of the Protestant churches had schools, and one of them was Concordia Lutheran School. Concordia started as being the first German Lutheran church. That was their name, the first German Lutheran church. Somewhere along the line, they changed their name to Concordia. They were located on Clay Street between Market and Jefferson. And a number of years afterwards, they moved to Broadway and Barrett, and that's where they are now. Their school lasted well up into the 1960s. Very long-lived school, but it's no longer in operation. Skipped one. If you had to name, I'm going to have to stand up because my remote doesn't work down low. If you had to name a profession that Germans had One of those is baking, right? German bakeries. Had them all over the place. Every neighborhood had several German bakeries. Or at least when I was growing up, they did. Heitzman Bakery was at Schnitzelberg at Burnett and Hickory. The building that occupied is now Monix. Wolf's Bakery in the West End at Market 26. You can go through all the neighborhoods and name German bakeries. Germans also had confectionaries. 4 of the first 25 German-speaking people who came to Louisville were bakers or confectioners. That tells you how many Germans are into these trades. Salger's Confectionery was at Broadway and 4th. In fact, it was on the northeast corner of Broadway and 4th. Do you know what's there now? The northeast corner of Broadway and 4th? Brown Hotel. Okay, so Salger's lasted that long until the Brown Hotel was built. Ship's Confectionery started out in Louisville, and after a period of time they moved over to Jeffersonville, and they are still actually in operation. Another trade the Germans were famous for is brewing beer, right? In the history of Louisville, there were about 200 German breweries. 200 breweries. By 1850, they were all owned by Germans. In the 1890s, there were 50 breweries operating simultaneously in Louisville. 50. Then along came Prohibition, and it wiped them all out. There were only 3 that came back from Prohibition. Those are the 3 that you're familiar with. Up at the top there is Ertle's Brewery, which was in Butchertown. Down at the bottom on the left is Fair's Brewery, which was at the corner of Jackson and Green Street, diagonally across the street from St. Boniface Church. And on the bottom right is Falls City Brewing Company, which was on Broadway down around 32nd Street. Put new batteries in this thing yesterday and you never know it. Now, if you make all of that beer, somebody has to drink it, right? So where'd you go to drink that beer? On weekdays, the men getting off from work, and us stressed men, the men went to the saloons. And one of those saloons was the Ruster Holt's Cafe on the top there. That was in Butchertown. And you didn't see any women in a saloon. And no proper woman would show her face in a saloon. If the woman wanted any beer, she would go to the side door with a bucket and get a bucket of beer to take home. On the bottom is Frank Bott's Saloon, which is at 34th in Missouri. Now, if you're not familiar with the street named Missouri, it's gone now. It was in Shippingport, and all the housing on Shippingport is long gone. You see one man there standing at the bar with his catch of fish. Now, on the weekends, you would go to a beer garden. Beer gardens were generally located on the outskirts of town, and 2 of the largest ones were the Phoenix Hill Park and Zinder's Summer Garden. Phoenix Hill Park was located on Baxter, and if you can visualize this, if you start out at Jefferson Street and you're going out away from town on Baxter, you're going up a hill, right? Toward Broadway. Okay, that's where the Phoenix Brewery and Phoenix Hill Park were located. Inside of those buildings was 2 acres of beer garden. And only 3/4 of a mile further out the road, further out Baxter, you come to where Bardstown Road and Baxter split. There used to be a Kentucky Fried Chicken on that point there. From that point all the way to Brinstead Drive was one huge beer garden, 3.5 acres, that was Zinder's Summer Garden. It's owned by Dominic Zender, who happens to be Vicky's great-grandfather. And in that 3/4 of a mile between these two huge beer gardens were 4 other beer gardens and 11 saloons in 3/4 of a mile. Germans didn't drink just beer, although you might suspect that. They also bottled mineral water, and they manufactured and bottled soft drinks. John Epping, you may remember Epping bottlers at Broadway and Campbell. They made Orange Crush. I'm sure you remember Orange Crush. So what is the beverage that's left out of this? Water, right? Nobody drank the water. They didn't drink it because it was contaminated. People got their water from wells on the corners of street intersections. Those wells tended to get contaminated by sewage and God knows what else. So there were cholera epidemics very frequently in Louisville, especially 2 large cholera epidemics in the 1840s. Those cholera epidemics in the 1840s led the city of Louisville to establish the Louisville Water Company in 1854, and so you see the Louisville Water Tower there. The first water was not filtered, so there was a strategy to drinking a glass of water that you would pour the water, then you'd have to let it settle for a couple of minutes, and then all of the sediment was on the bottom, and you could go ahead and drink the water. Sounds like bad water to me. So as a result of the cholera epidemics, 2 of the Catholic parishes, St. Boniface and Immaculate Conception, which is no longer around, it used to be on 8th Street, pastors of those 2 churches established St. Joseph Orphan's Home, which now is located on Frankfort Avenue. That's the 3rd location of that orphanage. And the Protestants, being jealous of the Catholics having their own orphanage, they had to have one too. So they built the German Protestant Orphan Asylum, which was on Jefferson Street at about 19th. This orphanage subsequently moved to Bardstown Road, where Mid-City Mall is now located. And then when Mid-City Mall was built, they moved to Goldsmith Lane. They changed their names, they called themselves Brooklawn. You're probably familiar with Brooklawn. Germans in medicine. Here's 2 prominent Germans who were in medicine. Samuel Gross taught at the Louisville Medical School downtown. He was from the German-speaking part of Pennsylvania, didn't even know how to speak English until he went to college. But he came to Louisville, and he wrote 2 widely known and hailed manuals of surgery that soldiers used in the Civil War. The man on the right, maybe you're a bit familiar with his name if you've ever gone to Jewish Hospital, Abraham Flexner. They have Abraham Flexner Way that you have to go through on the way to the parking garage. Flexner was not a physician. All of his brothers were physicians, but Flexner was an educator. Abraham was. But he did more for medicine than his brothers ever did. All rolled together, he did more. Abraham Flexner wrote a manual on medical education in the United States. He found out where doctors were trained the best, which happened to be Germany, and he adopted that to the United States system, and his system is still used in medical colleges today. Hospitals. First hospital that was established by Germans was established by the 4 German Methodist churches. They called it German Methodist Deaconess Hospital. It was on 8th Street near Chestnut. It started in 1895 and lasted until the early 1950s. And it closed because of money problems, as you might suspect. So the Methodist churches needed some support to build a new hospital, so they approached the evangelical churches in Louisville, said, let's get together and build a new hospital. So they did. They built Methodist Evangelical Hospital at Broadway and Floyd, which has been taken over by Norton's now. Down at the bottom, that is St. Anthony Hospital. It was founded and operated by an order of German Franciscan nuns. It was built in 1905 and closed in 1990, and I believe that Kindred is what is there now. Germans published newspapers in German so that German-speaking people could get the news. The Louisville Anzeiger is the newspaper that lasted the longest. It started in 1849 and didn't close until 1938. It's a run of 89 years. Another long-lived German newspaper was the Volksblatt, Louisville Volksblatt. Here, the Sunday edition of the Volksblatt was called the Omnibus, and it featured that distinct masthead. There were newspapers that were specialized for certain purposes. For example, if you happen to be Catholic, you probably get the Record these days. But before the Record, there was the Glaubensbote. It was how Catholics got news about things going on with the Catholic churches in Louisville. Germans liked to sing, so they established singing societies. The first one was the Liederkranz Society. This depiction is from 1865, but the Liederkranz started in 1848, and it lasted until 1959. That's a period of 111 years. There were overall about 20 German singing societies in Louisville's history. The only one left is the one down at the bottom, the Social Mill Chorus, which now calls itself the German American Club. The German American Club was founded in 1878 and is still going today. I believe that it is 143 years old at this point. Meanwhile, back in Germany, they're still trying to unify all of those individual states that were in the German Confederation. And the issue rose to a head in 1848, where in various cities they had riots of people wanting a unified government and a unified country. And they almost pulled it off. The reason that they didn't pull it off is they didn't have the backing of the Prussian army. And because of that, the revolution failed. And of course, you know what happens with revolutions. The winners stay, the losers have to go. So the losers left, and a lot of them came to the United States. And here are three of them. The man on the left is Carl Schurz. Carl Schurz did not live in Louisville. He settled in Missouri, but I put his picture in here because he was so outstanding. He became a Civil War general, and he was the first German-born person elected to the U.S. Senate representing the state of Missouri. And he was Secretary of the Interior in the Hayes administration. The man in the middle is Albert Fink. Albert Fink was trained as an engineer, and he came to the United States at the invitation of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And so he was designing bridges for the B&O Railroad for a period of time. When James Guthrie, who founded the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, he needed an engineer, and he enticed Fink to come to the United States, or come to Kentucky and live in Louisville, work for the L&N. And so Fink built a number of notable bridges. The first notable bridge they built was across the Green River. It was erected during the Civil War, but unfortunately it was blown up by the Confederates as they invaded Kentucky. So his masterpiece didn't last too long, But he wasn't deterred. In 1871, he built the first bridge across the Ohio River at Louisville. It's a railroad bridge so that the L&N could deal with markets north of the Ohio River. And the piers of that bridge are still there. That is the bridge that runs across the Ohio River right where the locks are. If you're familiar, standing at the wharf off to your left, there's a long bridge that has a lift section in it across the canal. The piers on that bridge are the original Fink Bridge. The superstructure has been rebuilt. Fink subsequently left Louisville to work for the Grand Trunk Railroad, but did a lot for Louisville while he was here. Another person that was in Louisville for a short period of time was Carl Heinzen. Heinzen was a radical. He was thrown out of Germany once for making trouble. He snuck back in, and after the 1848 revolution, they threw him back out again. He came to Louisville and he started a newspaper called The Pioneer. And Heinzen is best known for co-authoring with a man named Bernard Domscheit a manifesto called the Louisville Platform. The Louisville Platform espoused things like abolition of slavery, rights for women, abolition of organized religions, and a number of other points that totally went across the grain of what was going on in the United States at that time. So his manifesto wasn't very well received, and people tended to broad brush all Germans with Heinzen's ideas. Another group that came after the 1848 revolution were the Turners. The Turners were a gymnastics organization founded by Friedrich Jahn in 1811. They fled Germany after the revolution because they too wanted a unified Germany. And they made trouble. The Turners had to have a gym to practice in, so this is one of their gyms on the right up there. That house was the boyhood home of Louis Brandeis, so happened. And there is a large structure that's built on the back of that home, and that was the gymnasium that the Turners used. Of course, the Turners aren't there anymore. They're down on River Road now. So in 1855, this is Louisville, and you can see that it's grown. The southern boundary now is Kentucky Street rather than Broadway. On the west, the city of Louisville takes in Portland. On the east, it takes in Butchertown. All of the Germans, or almost all of the Germans, lived on the east side of the city over here in an area that was called Uptown. We now call that area Phoenix Hill. The Irish who came in the 1840s lived to the west of the city center over here. There were about 1/3 of the population of the city were Germans. And there were about half as many Irish as there were Germans. So if you add 1/3 and 1/6, you get 1/2, right? If I remember my math correctly. 1/2 of the city were immigrants. And that unsettled a lot of people that half